The light first appeared on a Thursday in October when Thomas Weaver was searching the cellar for his father's old toolbox. And what caught his eye wasn't the pale glow itself, faint as a dying firefly, pulsing in the corner behind the furnace, but the fact that there was no source for it, no bulb or lamp or crack in the foundation, letting in streetlight, just luminescence floating in the darks like something alive, something watching, something that had been waiting in that corner for longer than Thomas had been coming down to this cellar, perhaps longer than anyone had been coming down here, waiting with the patience of things that exist outside of time. He stood on the bottom step with the string from the overhead bulb still swaying from when he'd pulled it, casting moving shadows across the stone walls and dirt floor. And he watched the light pulse, once, twice, 3 times, in rhythm with something he couldn't identify, but that felt uncomfortably like a heartbeat. And though every rational part of his mind said to go back upstairs, to forget he'd seen it, to leave this problem for another day, or another person, or simply never, his feet carried him forward across the cellar floor toward that impossible glow. Because Thomas Weaver had spent 37 years ignoring the strange things in his family's house and in his family's history. And he was tired of not knowing, tired of the silence that lived in this house like a fourth member of the family, tired of pretending everything was normal when nothing had ever been normal in the house on Ashwood Lane. Thomas had moved back into his childhood home 3 months ago, after his mother's death, after the lawyers had finished with the estate, after it became clear that no one else in the family wanted the house, and someone had to do something with it before it fell completely into disrepair. His sister Rachel had made her position clear from her home in California. Sell it. Burn it down. I don't care. I'm never stepping foot in that place again. His brother Marcus, the middle child, had been even more direct. That house killed Mom and it killed Dad, and if you're smart, you'll walk away from it too. But Thomas wasn't smart, or maybe he was too curious, or maybe he'd always known that eventually he'd have to come back here and face whatever it was that had made his childhood feel like living in a museum where the exhibits moved when you weren't looking, and the docent smiled too widely and knew things about you that you'd never told anyone. The house was a Victorian built in 1889, 3 stories plus a cellar that had been dug by hand into the Connecticut hillside. One of those old homes that appeared on historical society tours and in coffee table books about New England architecture. 4 bedrooms, hardwood floors, original woodwork, a wraparound porch that had once been painted white but now flaked gray like old skin. Thomas's great-great-grandfather had built it, and Weavers had lived in it continuously since then. 5 generations of the same family in the same house, which should have felt like continuity and tradition, but instead felt like a sentence that none of them had been clever enough to escape. The cellar had always been the worst part. Low-ceilinged, musty, with walls of rough stone that wept moisture even in summer. As children, they'd been forbidden to go down there unsupervised, though the stated reason changed depending on which parent you asked. Dad said it was because of the old furnace, which was temperamental and potentially dangerous. Mom said it was because the stairs were steep and she worried about them falling. But Thomas had always known the real reason was the same reason none of them liked being alone in the house. The same reason Mom would sometimes stand in the hallway staring at nothing with her hands pressed to her mouth. The same reason Dad had started drinking in his 40s and never stopped until the alcohol had stopped him. There was something wrong with the house. Everyone in the family knew it. No one ever said it. Now Thomas stood in the cellar, 5 feet from the light, and he could see it clearly. Not a reflection, not a trick of shadow, a distinct glow, roughly spherical, about the size of a softball, hovering 3 feet off the ground. It pulsed with that same rhythm, steady and organic. And as Thomas watched, it moved, not much, just a slight drift to the left, then back, like it was floating in water, subject to invisible currents. Thomas's rational mind offered explanations: phosphorescent mold, swamp gas, heat shimmer from the furnace. But he'd been in this cellar hundreds of times and never seen anything like this. And the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was something else. "Hello?" Thomas called out, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. The light pulsed faster, just for a moment, as if responding, then settled back into its steady rhythm. Thomas stepped closer. The light didn't retreat. At 3 feet distance, he could see that it wasn't uniform. There were darker spots within it, shadows, shapes that shifted and rearranged themselves. And there was a temperature difference. The air near the light was colder than the rest of the cellar, cold enough that Thomas could see his breath. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling. The light pulsed once, hard, bright enough that Thomas flinched back. But it didn't move away, didn't flee. It seemed to be waiting. Thomas's fingers entered the glow, cold, intense cold, like plunging his hand into ice water. But also something else, a tingling sensation, almost electric, and a feeling of presence, of being noticed, of being examined by something intelligent, something that had opinions about him, something that recognized him. Images flooded Thomas's mind. Not quite memories, not quite visions. A flash of this cellar as it had been decades ago, dirt floor unpacked, stone walls bare. A woman's face, not anyone Thomas recognized, crying, her hands bloody. A child's shoe, small and worn, lying in the corner where the light now hovered. A sound like digging, rhythmic and desperate. And underneath it all, a feeling of overwhelming grief, of something lost that could never be found, of a wrong that had never been righted. Thomas jerked his hand back, gasping. The light pulsed once more, then slowly began to fade, dimming until it was barely visible, just the faintest glow in the corner. And then it was gone. Thomas stood in the cellar, his heart hammering, his right hand still tingling from the cold. He looked around wildly, searching for any explanation, any rational cause for what he'd just experienced. But there was nothing. Just the furnace humming, the overhead bulb swaying slightly, the smell of damp earth and old stone. He went back upstairs, locked the cellar door even though it had never been locked before, and poured himself a drink with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He thought about calling his siblings, telling them what he'd seen. But he could already hear their responses. Rachel would say he was stressed, that moving back home was triggering old anxieties. Marcus would say the house was finally getting to him the way it had gotten to everyone else, and he should get out while he still could. So Thomas said nothing. He sat in the kitchen of his childhood home and drank his father's whiskey and tried to convince himself he'd imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, grief. All reasonable explanations for hallucination. But he hadn't imagined it. He knew that with a certainty that felt like nausea. The light came back the next night. Thomas had been avoiding the cellar all day, had found excuses to stay on the upper floors, had told himself he'd deal with it tomorrow, next week, never. But at 11 p.m., lying in bed unable to sleep, he heard it, a sound from below. Not loud, just a faint scraping, like someone digging, like the sound from his vision. Thomas got out of bed and went downstairs. The cellar door stood open, though he'd locked it. He approached slowly, turned on the overhead light, descended the stairs. The light was back, brighter this time, larger, still floating in the same corner, still pulsing with that heartbeat rhythm. But now it was big enough that Thomas could see more details within it. The shapes weren't just shapes. They were scenes, moments, fragments of something that had happened here. He saw the woman again, the one with the bloody hands. She was digging in the corner, tears streaming down her face, her movements frantic and desperate. A man stood behind her, Thomas's great-grandfather, he realized with a shock, recognizing him from old photographs. The man was speaking, his face angry, his hands gesturing violently. The woman was crying, shaking her head, continuing to dig. And then Thomas saw what she was digging up. A small bundle, wrapped in cloth, stained and dark. She lifted it carefully, cradled it, and her sobbing intensified. The man grabbed her arm, tried to take the bundle away. They struggled. And then, the image cut off. The light dimmed. Thomas felt sick. He understood what he was seeing. What had happened in this cellar more than a century ago. Someone had died. A child, probably. And they'd been buried here, in the corner, hidden away. And the woman, the mother, had tried to dig them up, to reclaim them, and had been stopped. "Who are you?" Thomas whispered to the light. "What do you want?" The light pulsed 3 times, rapid and bright. Then, it started moving, drifting across the cellar floor toward the opposite wall. Thomas followed, compelled by something he didn't understand but couldn't resist. The light stopped at the eastern wall, near the stairs, and hovered there. Thomas examined the wall. It looked the same as the others. Rough stone, mortar, nothing unusual. But the light pulsed insistently, and Thomas found himself running his hands over the stones, feeling for something. A loose stone, maybe. A hollow space. His fingers found a section where the mortar had crumbled more than elsewhere. He picked at it, and a piece came away easily. Then another. Behind the stones was a gap, and in that gap, something wrapped in oilcloth. Thomas pulled it out carefully. The oilcloth was old, brittle, but had protected its contents. Inside was a book, a journal, handwritten, dated 1891. The light pulsed once, bright and satisfied, then slowly faded away, leaving Thomas alone with his discovery. He took the journal upstairs, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table as dawn broke, and read. The journal belonged to Mary Weaver, his great-great-grandmother, wife of Jonathan Weaver, who built the house. The early entries were mundane. Daily life, household matters, notes about her children. She'd had 4, Michael, Sarah, Daniel, and the youngest, James, born in 1890. The entries from winter 1891 were different. Mary wrote about James's illness, how he'd caught a fever that wouldn't break, how the doctor had done all he could, but the baby was failing. She wrote about Jonathan's anger, his refusal to accept that their son might die, his insistence that prayer and will would save him. And then, February 15th, 1891. James died this morning. He was 7 months old. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I know it was my fault. I didn't keep him warm enough. I didn't notice soon enough that he was sick. I killed my baby through neglect, and now Jonathan won't speak to me. And Michael asked where James went, and I couldn't answer because I can barely breathe through the grief. Jonathan wants to bury him in the town cemetery, but I can't bear it. I can't bear the thought of my baby in the cold ground so far from the house. I want him close. I need him close. I've begged Jonathan to let me keep James here, to bury him in the cellar where he'll be dry and safe, and where I can visit him whenever I need to. Jonathan thinks I'm mad with grief, but I don't care. This is what I need. February 17th, 1891. Jonathan agreed. We bury James tonight in the cellar, in the corner behind the furnace where it's warmest. No one knows except us. No death certificate, no obituary, no gravestone. The town will think he's away with relatives recovering from his illness, and eventually they'll forget to ask about him. Jonathan insisted on this secrecy. He says it's illegal to bury someone on private property without proper procedures, that we could face criminal charges. But I don't care about the law. I only care that my baby is home. The entries after that were sparse, erratic. Mary wrote about hearing James crying at night, about going down to the cellar to sit with him, about Jonathan's anger when he found her there. She wrote about the other children, forgetting they'd ever had a baby brother, about how she tried to keep his memory alive, but everyone else seemed determined to pretend he'd never existed. The final entry was dated December 1891. Jonathan has forbidden me from going to the cellar. He's had Daniel help him move heavy storage in front of James's corner, blocking it off. He says I'm obsessing, that I'm neglecting the living children for the dead one, that I need to move on. But how can I move on? How can I forget my baby? I go down there when Jonathan is sleeping, move the storage, sit with James. I've started seeing things in the dark. A light, warm and golden, where James is buried. It comforts me. It feels like he's reaching out, reminding me he's still here, still my son, still needing his mother. Jonathan says there's no light, that I'm imagining it, but I see it clearly. I see my son, still present, still waiting for me. That was the last entry. Thomas checked records the next day at the Town Historical Society. Mary Weaver had died in spring of 1892, apparently from complications of influenza, though the death was poorly documented. She'd been 28 years old, and nowhere in any family records, in any town documents, in any photograph or letter or mention, was there any reference to a child named James. As far as history was concerned, Mary and Jonathan had had 3 children, not 4. The youngest boy had been written out of existence as completely as if he'd never been born. That night, Thomas went back to the cellar. The light was waiting, brighter now, almost eager. And this time, when Thomas approached it, the images were clearer. He saw Mary's funeral, saw Jonathan and the 3 remaining children standing over her grave. He saw Jonathan going to the cellar immediately after, saw him mixing concrete, saw him sealing off the corner where James was buried, building a new wall over the old one, entombing his infant son behind stone and mortar. And he saw Mary, or Mary's spirit, or Mary's grief made manifest, appearing in the cellar that night. Saw her finding the new wall, saw her tearing at it with bloody hands, saw her collapsing in despair when she couldn't break through, saw her stay there, night after night, year after year, decade after decade, a presence in the cellar, a light in the darkness, still trying to reach her child. Thomas understood now what he was seeing. Not James's ghost. James had been too young to have a conscious spirit. This was Mary. Mary, who'd been driven mad by grief, who'd died still fixated on her lost child, who'd somehow remained in the cellar, bound to the place where her baby was buried, unable to move on because she couldn't reach him. "You want me to find him," Thomas said to the light. "You want me to break through the wall and find James." The light pulsed affirmatively, brighter than it had ever been. Thomas went upstairs and called his siblings. "You need to come home," he said. "Both of you. I found something in the house. Something that explains everything." "I'm not coming back there," Rachel said immediately. "Neither am I," Marcus agreed. "There was a 4th child," Thomas said, "in 1890. A baby named James. He died and was buried in the cellar, and then everyone pretended he never existed. And I think his mother's been down there ever since, trying to reach him." Silence on the other end of the lines. Then Rachel, "What are you talking about?" Thomas explained everything. The light, the journal, the history he'd uncovered. When he finished, both his siblings were quiet. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Do you know what you're saying? That there's a baby buried in our cellar, and our great-great-grandmother's ghost is haunting the house because of it? I know how it sounds, but I've seen her. I've seen what she's shown me. And I think," Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think she's been there our whole lives. I think that's what we always felt in the house. Not malevolence, just grief, just a mother who can't let go." Rachel made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "That's what Mom always said, wasn't it? That the house was sad, that it mourned. We thought she was being poetic, but she was being literal," Thomas finished. "She felt it too. They all did. Every generation living here, feeling this grief, this loss, but none of them knowing where it came from or what to do about it." "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. "I want to break through the wall, find James, Give him a proper burial. Maybe that will give Mary peace. Maybe that will finally end this. Another long silence. Then Rachel, I'll fly in tomorrow. If you're really doing this, I want to be there. Me too, Marcus said. We do this together. As a family. They came. Rachel from California, Marcus from Boston. They met in the house where they'd grown up. The house that had always felt wrong in ways they couldn't articulate. And together, they went to the cellar. The light was waiting. It had grown larger, brighter, more defined. Now Thomas could see Mary's face within it, young and grief-stricken and desperate. "Hello, Mary," Thomas said softly. "We're going to help you." The light pulsed, and Thomas swore he could feel gratitude radiating from it. They'd hired a contractor, someone from out of town who wouldn't ask too many questions about why they were demolishing a cellar wall. It took most of the day. The wall Jonathan had built was thick, solid, designed to last forever. But eventually it came down, stone by stone, revealing the old corner behind it. And there, in the dirt floor, they found him. A small skeleton, wrapped in decayed cloth, a baby who'd been dead for 134 years, but who'd never been properly mourned, properly released, properly acknowledged. Thomas, Rachel, and Marcus stood looking at their ancestor, this child who'd been erased from history, and all three of them were crying. "I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered. "I'm sorry, no one remembered you." They called the police, explained they'd found human remains during renovation. An investigation followed, brief since the remains were clearly historical. The medical examiner confirmed it was an infant, approximately 7 months old, dead for over a century. Given the circumstances and the journal Thomas provided, the police agreed to release the remains to the family for proper burial. They held a funeral, small, private, just the 3 siblings and a minister. They buried James Weaver in the town cemetery, gave him a headstone with his name and dates, finally acknowledged his existence after more than a century of erasure. And that night, Thomas went to the cellar one last time. The light was there, but different now. Softer, calmer, more at peace. As Thomas watched, it drifted up from the corner, floated across the cellar, and hovered in front of him. And within the glow, he saw Mary's face clearly for the first time. Young, beautiful, exhausted, but relieved. "Thank you," he heard, though not with his ears. The words formed directly in his mind. "Thank you for finding him. Thank you for remembering him. Thank you for letting me go." "Is he with you now?" Thomas asked. The light pulsed, and Thomas felt her, yes. Felt her joy at finally being reunited with her son, at finally being able to hold him again, at finally being released from the prison of her own grief. "We're sorry," Thomas said. "Sorry it took so long. Sorry you had to wait." "You didn't know," Mary's voice whispered in his mind. "None of you knew. But you listened when I finally found a way to show you. That's what matters." The light began to fade, slowly, peacefully. As it dimmed, Thomas felt something lift from the house, felt the atmosphere change. The sadness that had always permeated the walls, the grief that had soaked into the floorboards, the sense of wrongness that had haunted 5 generations. It was dissipating, flowing away, leaving with Mary as she finally moved on. The light faded to nothing. The cellar was just a cellar again. Dark, musty, but no longer oppressive, no longer wrong. Thomas went upstairs to where his siblings were waiting. "She's gone," he said. "They both are. They're finally at peace." Rachel nodded, tears on her face. "I can feel it. The house feels different." "Lighter," Marcus agreed, like it's been holding its breath for a century and finally exhaled. They stayed in the house that night, all 3 of them, for the first time since childhood. And for the first time, none of them felt uncomfortable. None of them felt watched. None of them felt like they were intruding on someone else's grief. In the morning, they made a decision. They wouldn't sell the house. They'd keep it in the family, but they'd acknowledge its history. They'd put up a small plaque in the cellar commemorating James and Mary Weaver, ensuring they'd never be forgotten again. And Thomas would stay, would make this house his home, would try to fill it with new memories, new life, new joy to replace the century of sorrow it had held. 6 months later, Thomas was working in the cellar, organizing storage, installing better lighting, when he saw it. Just for a moment, in the corner where Mary's light had been, a flicker of warmth, a glow that lasted only a second before disappearing. He'd stopped, his heart racing, wondering if she'd come back. But it didn't feel like before. This felt different, not desperate or grieving, just present, aware. As if Mary and James were checking in, making sure he was okay, making sure the house was being cared for. Thomas smiled at the corner. "We're good here," he said aloud. "You can rest now. We won't forget you." The corner remained dark, but Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest. Not the cold of Mary's desperate haunting, but the warmth of acceptance, of gratitude, of a mother and child finally reunited, finally at peace, finally able to watch over the family home from a place of love rather than loss. He went back upstairs, made coffee, sat on the porch in the autumn afternoon. The house had been heavy for so long, weighted down by a secret so terrible that 5 generations had unconsciously carried its burden. But now, with that secret revealed, acknowledged, properly mourned, the house felt like it could breathe again. Like it could be just a house, just a structure of wood and stone, rather than a container for grief that could never be expressed. Thomas thought about all the families who live in houses with histories they don't know, who inherit pain they can't name, who carry the weight of previous generations' secrets without understanding why everything feels just slightly wrong. He wondered how many houses hold similar stories, how many cellars hide similar sorrows, how many lights shine in darkness trying desperately to tell the living what the dead can never say. Да, конечно, вот завершение истории. But at least here, in this house, the secret was out. The light had appeared. The story had been told. The dead had been acknowledged. And finally, after 134 years, a mother and child could rest. Thomas lived in the house for the rest of his life. He married eventually, had children of his own, filled the rooms with laughter and light and the ordinary chaos of family life. And sometimes, on quiet nights, he'd go down to the cellar and stand in the corner where it had all begun. And he'd thank Mary for trusting him with her story, for showing him that even the deepest grief can be healed if someone is willing to listen, to see, to acknowledge what's been hidden away. Rachel and Marcus visited often now, no longer avoiding the house that had haunted their childhoods. They brought their families, told their children about James and Mary, made sure the story was passed down not as a ghost tale, but as a reminder that love persists beyond death, that grief unspoken becomes a wound that never heals, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is face what our ancestors couldn't, and finally set everyone free. The house on Ashwood Lane stands still, no longer mourning, no longer weighted by secrets too terrible to speak. 5 generations lived there in shadow, but the 6th generation would live in light, knowing that sometimes the dead don't haunt us because they're angry or evil, but because they're trying desperately to tell us something we need to hear. And all we have to do is stop running long enough to listen, to see the lights that appear in darkness, not as threats, but as messages, as calls for help, as love that refused to die, even when death had come and gone and left only grief behind. In cellars across New England, in basements and crawl spaces, and forgotten corners of old houses, lights flicker that no one can explain. And families feel presences they can't name. And children wake from dreams of people they've never met. And most of the time, these mysteries remain mysteries because we're too afraid to investigate, too rational to believe, too modern to accept that the past doesn't stay buried just because we stop looking at it. But sometimes, if we're brave enough or desperate enough or simply tired enough of living with ghosts we pretend don't exist, we'll follow the light into the darkness and find not monsters but mothers, not demons but grief that never learned how to end. And in that finding, we'll discover that the most haunted places aren't houses but hearts that carry secrets too heavy to hold alone. And the only exorcism that works is truth spoken aloud in cellars where light has been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally see it and ask the question that unlocks everything. What are you trying to tell me? And how can I help you rest?